All right, so today's talk is on the impact statement and why you really need to be thinking about this when you're doing grant writing. And in some ways, this has become probably the most important thing to hit and hit really, really well in getting your work funded now. While this talk is sort of focusing on formal impact statements for the NIH, it really is the make or break getting funded through any sort of organization, agency, or nonprofit. Um, because one of the biggest mistakes people make when they are writing grants is that they're too all up in their head. They know why what they're doing is important, but they are assuming that if they set down a set of very sort of dry evidence, everybody who reads your grant will get that immediately. And that is a very, very dangerous assumption to make. And it's probably a huge reason why people don't get funded, particularly young investigators. And just to give you an example, I just read a proposal that was written by a postdoctoral fellow for a project, and just yesterday. And this project is very, very technique driven. So every aim is all about the techniques being used. Even the title of the proposal is about the techniques being used. And I pretty much guarantee you that no reader is going to get excited about that. And this need to emphasize the why we care is probably the most important thing. Now, so I'll start with the NIH definition of impact. And this is the likelihood for a project to exert a sustained, powerful influence on the research fields involved. In other words, why does anybody care? If we learn the answers from your research, is this really going to move the field? Now, that could have a lot of different, what impact is, it could have a lot of different features. It could be that it's a basic science project. NIH does fund research in plants, for instance. And when they do fund research in plants, it's that the plant has been sold as a model system to be able to study something that is generally applicable to the basic science of life. It also could have an impact on patient care. It could have an impact on our understanding of a disease. But you really, really need to have in your mind what is the potential impact of your research on the field. And even more importantly, once you can articulate that impact, you have to make sure that it is abundantly clear to the reviewer that your research is important and will have some sort of sustained impact on the field. What this means is that good, well-controlled science is not enough. There's lots of projects that one can do that are well-controlled, but the answer is trivial or not immediately apparent about why we care about why you're doing the experiment. All right. So from the straight NIH scoring perspective, impact is given as a numerical score, and it's on a scale of 1 to 9, and 1 means high impact and 9 means no impact, essentially. This is a subjective assessment by the assigned reviewers based on the overall package of all of the criteria scores. You know, is that innovative? Is it important? How are you as an investigator? Are you going to get it done? How is your environment? Is your environment conducive to getting it done? Now, when you actually see an impact score, when you actually see an impact score, you're going to be seeing it on the scale of 10 to 90 when you actually get your grant back. And as I've mentioned in prior presentations, that's because that the impact score is based on the opinion of everybody on that study section, and it is essentially the average score that everybody on the study section gives times 10. Okay, so when people are reviewing grants, how are they assessing impact? And really the biggest one is, does this problem have a big picture importance? And is the unanswered question that the grant is investigating important to that larger field? And is the experimental design likely to answer the question? And is the investigator institutional environment conducive to make that project likely to succeed? And, so investigator institutional environment, it could be, do you have access to the patients you need to do this study? Do you have access to the equipment to do this study? Does the investigator have access to the space to do the study? And as you as an investigator, do you have a track record suggesting that you are able to get this project actually done? Now, there is an official impact statement that is a paragraph written by the reviewers that's used to justify the score. Now, what I always recommend to people is that you also write an impact statement and put that into your grant application. It's not a formal requirement. However, that it really does help you get a good impact score out of your reviewers. And the reason for this is that the best grants make it easy for the reviewers. Keep in mind that reviewers are doing this probably after the end of a hard day of work. They are generally not thinking about your project, and they're often reviewed by a mixture of direct subject matter experts as well as people who are generally experts. So it might be that you don't have 3 reviewers as your primary reviewers who really know this literature backwards and forwards. So while a deep subject matter expert might be able to see immediately why what you're doing is important, the general experts, like if you have a cell biology project, there's somebody who's expert in cell biology but not in this pathway, or somebody who's expert in your pathway but not in this system. Or it could be that if it's a clinical grant, somebody who is very, very familiar with working in patient populations, but not this specific patient population. They might not see immediately why your grant is important. And that grants that can really, really articulate how important the work is and directly can specify how your proposed research will move the project forward and move the field forward, they generally receive higher scores. And this is just because the reviewers can understand them better. And it also, spelling out the impact of the grant makes it easier for them to be your advocate without having to work hard. It allows somebody who's reading the grant very, very superficially. That might be the other 17 or 20 people in the room that are not your assigned reviewers who are only quickly looking through your IMPS page. They need to have some guidance about how to score your grant. They need to know very, very clearly why this grant is something that absolutely should be done. And the other thing to keep in mind is that your assigned reviewers, that if your grant is receiving a high enough initial score to be discussed, you want your assigned reviewers to advocate for your grant. You want them to be able to very clearly and concisely explain why it is incredibly important for your grant to be funded. And you don't want to make the reviewers come up with the arguments about the importance of your work independently. You want to tell that reviewer why it's important. It makes it way, way easier for the reviewer then to explain this cogently to the people who they have to convince, which is the other members of the study section who are also going to be voting. All right. And the other issue with being able to articulate impact statements is that you want to set that agenda. You want to set the thought processes of the reviewers. You do not want the reviewers to be thinking independently here. you want them to be able to very, very clearly, and you want to tell them what the impact is so that they can just articulate it. Now, I realize that as a grant writer, that this almost feels dirty. This is the idea of marketing your work. And very often when you read grants, even for very established people, they read like we're just setting out the facts and that you should be able to, as the reader, see immediately what the importance of that work is. It should be obvious. But it's often not. Keep in mind that you are spending your life working on your project. You have been thinking about it deeply. You're already convinced that it's important, but that the reviewers might only spend a couple hours with your work. And if you're looking at the people on the study section who are not your assigned reviewers, they might only think about your grant for 10, 15 minutes that it's under discussion. You cannot assume that showing a lot of dry detail is going to, that the importance of doing this is going to be immediately obvious to who's reading your grant. And to be honest, you as the applicant should be the most capable person to make an accurate, crystal clear statement of your grant's overall impact. You have the ability to think about this for years. You're probably developing your grant over weeks or months, and you should be able to, in a very clear, concise, think about it as a 5-minute or 3-sentence elevator speech to say why what you're doing is important and critical. And another thing to understand is that NIH has actually done a study trying to understand, is the quality of science funded by the NIH uneven among fields? And it turned out that the study failed. And the reason the study failed is that it turns out that if the reviewer has direct subject matter expertise in an application, they are more likely to rank it higher than an application from outside of the field. And this is just because if they're a subject matter expert, they can see that impact or importance of that work much, much clearer than somebody who is very well trained but not working directly on that problem. That said, a lot of decisions about your grant are in fact made by non-subject matter experts. That generally at least one of your primary assigned reviewers is not a direct subject matter expert, that most of the people who are actually voting on your grant on the study section are not direct subject matter experts. They're familiar, they're expert, but they're not one of the 10 people who are directly trying to answer your problem. So what that means is that you have to be able to convince people who are not enmeshed in the problem that your work is important and worthy of funding. Then it goes even beyond that, though. The actual director or program director at the NIH, they're not direct subject matter experts on their work, and that essentially that they're seeing the recommendations for the study section. But there's a lot of grants that are in a gray area that they have to make decisions about which grants of similar scores are going to be funded or not. If when they read the grant, they're convinced that this work absolutely has to be done for the field, again, even 2 grants with the same score, one grant that makes that case better than another is much more likely to be funded, especially grants on the bubble or in the gray area of the funding priorities. All right, so you should start by thinking about your project by crafting an overall impact sentence. And the goal here is to explain in 1 or 2 sentences why is the grant important, how will it forward the field, and why is it likely to be successful. So that there is a a grant. There's a really, really nice source called the Sciences Sherpa, and that they have some examples here of overall impact statements. That why so the first one is that whatever study this is, that it's going to have a large over impact on tuberculosis. That if we understood this better, that there could be novel new studies that could make a better vaccine. The second one here is looking at the development of interventions to reduce the occurrence of this condition. That it advances mechanisms of what's going on. Now, personally, I would take the third one further, is that they say that whatever this proposal was, it will fundamentally advance mechanistic understanding and normal and neoplastic functions. However, I would go even further and explicitly say why we care about that mechanistic understanding. That you do not think that your impact statement is too obvious, that you really need to spell it out for people. Okay. So overall, I would say be specific. General statements are not helpful. So don't say, oh, that this is impactful because this condition is the most important thing ever. That you want to say why learning the things you're going to learn from this grant are going to make an impact on whatever is going to make an impact. You be bleeding obvious. Do not be vague here. Be extraordinarily specific. Now, one thing that's also important, though, is try to be very, very objective when crafting this impact statement. And you also want that impact statement to really contribute to the mission of the funding agency. Now, this is a place where you really want to get advice. You really want to show it to other people. You really want to talk to other people about it. Because you really want to be speaking about it in a way that when people hear the project, they say, oh, wow, that's a cool project. Oh, wow, that's really important. And this will need to be a concise, like, elevator speech where you have the 1 or 2 minutes when you're going up in the elevator to convince whoever you're talking to that this is the most important project ever. Now, it's very important to make that impact, novelty, innovation extremely obvious, but you also want it to be legitimate. That if you can't solidly explain why this work is critical to the field or it has a direct health impact, you really need to step back and think about why you're working on this problem. If you aren't convinced that the project you're working on could directly help with the therapy, with everything else related to the project, then maybe you shouldn't be doing this project. Or you need to really step back and think about why the field will care. Because if you can't come up with it, I guarantee you the reviewers won't come up with it, and your grant won't get a good score. Okay. So, and as I would like to emphasize before, is that if you can't come up with it, the reviewers won't. Now, sometimes it can also really help to talk through your project with others in and outside your field. Sometimes that I've seen talking to investigators about their projects is that it's sometimes easier for the person you're talking to be able to come up with that impact statement than you can. Sometimes the investigator writing the grant is just too close to the project to see kind of the big picture excitement about it. That said, is that good grant writing can't help a bad project. If you and people you're talking to can't come up with a strong statement of the work's likely impact, you might want to completely scrap the project and reshift about what you're doing. Because sometimes people just are doing the next experiment that can be done and don't step back and think about why it should be done. So that, and that there's a lot of things that are good, well-controlled science that really nobody cares. Maybe the model system is no longer modeling the disease. Maybe that the problem is no longer interesting to the field. These are things that you really have to be pretty objective about as you're grant writing. Okay, so I will put in a pause here. So does anybody have any questions or anything they want to bring up at this point? All right. All right. So now you've been starting to craft those impact statements. Where should you put it in the application? That there's no section of an NIH grant application. However, they do state that you should describe the impact clearly in words relevant to the project. So what I recommend to people is that they place those impact statements strategically in the places most likely to be noticed. So absolutely it should be in the abstract. While the abstract of the grants aren't usually a big player in peer review, they are read by people working at the funding agencies. They're also, for federal grants, they're read by the congressional oversight folks. So you want people reading that abstract who are the general public. The abstracts of grants are public record if they're funded. You want them to be able to know the why they should care very, very quickly. Another really important place to put one is at the end of the Ames page. I usually reserve the last 3 to 5 lines of my specific Ames page to really outline why this project is going to make a sustained impact on the field. Keep in mind this might be the only part that's read by your program officer. Often they focus on reading the Ames pages. It also is the part that's read by the non-voting study section members, because generally the by the voting study section members who are not your assigned reviewers, because they really will only look over your grant in that 10-15 minutes that it's being discussed, so that if you have it there, then they can see it. It's also another really important place to put the overall impact statement of your grant is at the very end of the research plan. It's the last thing that's read by the study section member as they're working on the reviews. It's also, you never ever want to end a grant on a pitfall. That very often after you have talked about an aim, you're talking about data interpretation, and then very often you'll see the last step of an aim is a pitfall. Do you really want the last thing read by a study section member to be a pitfall about why this particular experiment may not work? Or is the last thing you want them to read something that steps back and reminds them of the big picture importance? So from a human nature point of view, having an impact statement there at the very, very end of the grant can be a really important thing. Now, another thing, though, is that you want to make sure that your impact statement is supported, that it's the impact scores given are basically a reviewer, it's their overall impression of the importance of the work. That you don't just want to say, yes, of course my work is important and it will cure cancer or whatever. You want to explicitly be saying why the specific thing you're studying is going to be making an impact on the field. Just having a vague statement isn't going to be bought by the reviewer. And you want to make sure that the entire grant does feed into that impact statement. Another mistake people sometimes make is that there's some kind of a discontinuity between the problem that is explicitly talked about in the Ames page or the intro or the impact statement and what will really be coming out of the research plan. So you want to make sure that all of these things are cross-referenced appropriately. Another thing you can put in your impact statement is something that is particularly innovative or specific experiment that is really, really important that will support the idea that this is in fact going to be a very impactful project. All right. So now from a take-home message point of view, we can talk about concise, accurate impact statements, help focus your proposal on things that the reviewer and funding agencies is likely to care about. So if you can come up with one very early in your grant writing process, and you always are thinking to refer things back to that, that can be very, very helpful. You can also, they can be used to direct the reviewer towards why they care about the proposal. That also is that it gives the reviewer some really good marketing language to market your proposal to the rest of the study section to give you a high score. Now, these are two kind of big picture impact statements. But another thing that I would also really encourage you to think about is to not just put impact statements there, is that also put them kind of as sub-impact statements after the end of every experiment. So that in your aims, at the end of every aim, remind the reviewer why they care and about the importance of that aim. So again, don't end an aim on a pitfall. End an aim on reminding them why the work is important. When you're talking about data interpretation, that's another good place to also weave in comments about impact, is that by doing a particular experiment, we're really going to move the field in a particular way or another. So while having a couple named impact areas, one at the end of the aims page, one at the end of the proposal overall, keep referring back to why doing certain experiments is in fact going to be important to the field. So don't just have impact statements in one place. You never want to just have this stream of consciousness of experiments. Every single experiment ideally should be reflecting back to its importance to this big picture. Okay. Now, there are some really good articles that have been written on this, and there's some suggestions here about working impact into an aims page. This article in Science is in Nature is really helpful in thinking about how to market and how to sell your work. There's also a very nice book that's called Marketing for Scientists. And that's something that's worth reading. That book is actually written by a guy who is both a physicist as well as he's a country music, he writes country music songs. And he relates how he needs to sell his songs to Nashville to how he has to write grants to get his work funded. Okay? All right, so with that, I think I'm mostly done with the formal part of the presentations, but I'd really like to open it up for questions to see if people have any questions about how to do this and how to work this into a proposal. So if there are questions, I'm not hearing any, and it might be because your microphone is muted. I don't know if that's the case or not.
And also, please feel free to use the chat option if your microphone doesn't work.
You know, and also from people in the call, if you ever want, to just send me an aims page, I'd be happy to look at it and see if it really is conveying impact very, very well. That one thing that I'll tell you is that 20 years ago when I started in this business, there wasn't the same kind of emphasis on this marketing and impact. Grants tended to read a lot more dryly. And some of it is that grants used to be a lot longer. So you had a lot more room to really talk about how your work fits into the broader literature. Now with grants having gotten to be quite a bit shorter, that you have to be able to get to the point very, very quickly. So coming in on one of these 1 or 2 line impact statements can actually be really, really helpful. Okay. So I'm still not hearing any questions. So if there's not, I guess I'll wrap things up, and Erin can stop recording if people wanted to ask questions not recording.